This is one of the most controversial companies on Earth, often described as one of the most powerful and most criticized corporations in history. It operates in over 180 countries and generates more than $90 billion every year, with products that quietly reach millions of people daily. But what makes it so controversial is not just its size, it's the level of influence it's often accused of having over global food systems, water access, and supply chains, influence that many argue even governments struggle to fully regulate or control. The company is called Nestlé, and this is why it's considered one of the most powerful and most criticized corporations in the world. How this system works. To understand the company, we need to go back, not to a single moment in time, but to the structure behind how global food systems actually operate. Because when most people think about food, they think about brands, different names on supermarket shelves, different packaging, different prices. But in reality, much of the global food system is controlled by a small number of multinational corporations that operate across hundreds of countries. And one of the most influential among them is Nestlé now. At its most basic level, this is a food and beverage company. It produces and distributes products in categories like bottled water, coffee, dairy, confectionery, and infant nutrition. These are everyday products, things most people don't think twice about when buying. But what makes this company a global point of discussion is not just what it sells, it's the scale at which it operates. It has a presence in more than 180 countries around the world. That means its products are part of supply chains that reach nearly every major market on the planet. And with annual revenues in the tens of billions of dollars, it stands as one of the largest food companies in modern history. But scale alone is not what creates controversy. The real discussions begin when you look at the industries it operates in, because food is not a luxury product, it is a basic necessity, so is water, and so is infant nutrition. When a single corporation becomes deeply involved in essential human needs, its role becomes more complex than just business. It becomes part of infrastructure systems that people rely on every single day. And that is where public debate begins. Over the years, different reports, investigations, and activist groups have raised concerns about certain business practices in different regions. Some of these discussions have focused on water sourcing and bottling in resource-sensitive areas. Others have focused on marketing practices in developing markets, especially related to infant nutrition products, which have been the subject of long-standing global debate and regulatory attention.
In 2013, in Pakistan, it was found that Nestlé were diverting free, clean water away from thousands of people who were forced to drink sludge water because they couldn't afford to have it sold back to them in bottled form.
It is important to be precise here. These issues have been discussed in public, investigated in some cases, and legally reviewed in different countries over time. They are not single, unified claims, but a collection of ongoing debates across different markets and years. And this is what makes the company difficult to define in simple terms. Because on one side, it is a global supplier of essential products used by millions of people every day. And on the other side, it is a corporation that has repeatedly been at the center of public scrutiny about how global food systems should be managed. This tension between necessity and controversy is what keeps the company constantly under global attention. How the empire was built. That level of global influence didn't happen overnight. It was built step by step over more than a century. Started in the 1800s with a simple idea: developing food products that could help improve nutrition at a time when infant mortality was high and food preservation was limited. At the time, that kind of innovation was seen as life-changing, and in many ways it was. But as the company grew, the strategy changed. It was no longer just about creating products, it became about expanding into markets, and more importantly, owning distribution. Because in the food industry, the real power is not just what you produce, it's how widely and consistently you can deliver it. So over the decades, the company expanded aggressively, not just by launching new products, but by acquiring existing brands, local companies, regional favorites, established names that already had trust in their markets. Instead of competing with them, it absorbed them. And every acquisition added something important, access to new consumers, control over more shelf space, and deeper integration into local economies. This is how influence scales, quietly, systematically, until one company is no longer just a brand, but a network of hundreds of brands operating under one system. And once that happens, something interesting begins to occur. Consumers still think they are choosing between different companies, but in many cases, those different choices trace back to the same parent corporation. That level of consolidation is one of the reasons large food companies become so dominant. Because they're not just competing in the market, they are shaping it. But expansion alone does not create controversy. Controversy begins when growth intersects with sensitive systems. And one of the earliest and most widely discussed examples of that happened in the infant nutrition industry. During the 20th century, baby formula became a major global product. Originally designed for situations where breastfeeding wasn't possible, it quickly became a large commercial market. But the way it was marketed in certain regions sparked global criticism. Reports and investigations raised concerns about aggressive promotion strategies in developing countries. In some cases, marketing campaigns were said to encourage formula use in environments where access to clean water and proper sanitation was limited. Public health experts warned that improper preparation in those conditions could lead to serious health risks. These concerns led to international backlash. The issue had grown so large that it became a global public debate. This eventually contributed to the creation of guidelines by organizations like the Nestlé, aimed at regulating how infant nutrition products could be marketed. And for the first time, the company found itself at the center of a worldwide controversy.
Would you agree with me that your product should not be used where there is impure water? Yes or no?
We give all the instructions.
Just answer. What is your position?
Of course not, but we cannot cope with that.
Now, this is where the story becomes more complex. Because while critics pointed to ethical concerns and public health risks, the company maintained that its products served an important role, especially in situations where alternatives were not available. And this tension between commercial expansion and public health responsibility has never fully disappeared. But if that was the only controversy, the story would end there. It didn't.
The world's biggest food company, Nestlé.
The Nestle company.
Nestlé collects millions of gallons a year from springs in Southern California.
Because as the company continued to grow, it moved deeper into another essential resource. Something even more fundamental than food: water. Water extraction controversies, pricing versus access debates, and how this intensified global criticism. This is where the story gets even more intense. The water business. Water is the most basic resource on Earth. Every human needs it. Every system depends on it. And unlike most products, there is no substitute, which is why the global water industry is one of the most powerful and most controversial markets any company can enter. Over time, expanded deeply into this space, not just as a supplier, but as a major player in the bottled water business. At first glance, bottled water seems simple. Take water from a source, package it, distribute it. But behind that simplicity is a much more complex system involving water rights, local regulations, environmental impact, and community access. And this is where the criticism begins. In several regions around the world, activists and local communities have raised concerns about how large corporations source water. The argument is not just about selling water. It's about who controls access to it. Because in some areas, companies are allowed to extract large volumes of water from natural sources, while nearby communities depend on the same resources for daily use. This has led to ongoing debates about sustainability and fairness. Critics argue that when water is treated primarily as a commercial asset, it can create pressure on local ecosystems and public access.
Then my final question is what do you do, or what do you feel is your corporate responsibility to find out the extent of the use of your product in those circumstances in the developing part of the world? Do you feel that you have any responsibility?
Let me make it clear from the beginning. I have always supported the human right to water.
Supporters, on the other hand, argue that companies operate within legal frameworks and provide jobs, infrastructure, and investment in those regions. And again, the reality sits somewhere in the middle. But there have been specific cases that pushed this debate into the global spotlight. In the United States and parts of Asia, lawsuits and public campaigns have questioned how water extraction permits are granted and how resources are managed over time. In some regions, communities have protested against bottling operations, claiming that long-term extraction could affect local water availability. At the same time, the bottled water industry itself has continued to grow rapidly. Because from a business perspective, the model is extremely powerful. Water, once packaged and branded, can be sold at a significant markup compared to its original sourcing cost. And when combined with global distribution networks, it becomes a highly scalable product. But this is exactly what makes it controversial. Because unlike other consumer goods, water is not just a product, it is a necessity. And when a necessity becomes part of a global commercial system, every decision around it becomes more visible, more sensitive, and more debated. And this raises a deeper question. At what point does a company stop being just a participant in the market and start becoming a major influence over the system itself? Because when you combine control over food, influence in infant nutrition, and a growing presence in water, you are no longer looking at a typical corporation. You are looking at something much larger, a system that operates across multiple layers of everyday life. But even that is not the full picture, because there is another part of the story that is rarely discussed in detail. The supply chains behind some of the world's most popular products, and what happens at the very beginning of those chains, the hidden side of supply chains. By the time a product reaches the supermarket shelf, the story is already over. What you're seeing is the final step: clean packaging, recognizable branding, simple choice. But the real story begins much earlier, at the source. Because behind global food companies are supply chains that stretch across continents, often into regions most consumers will never see. And for Nestlé, one of the most important of those supply chains is cocoa. Cocoa is the raw ingredient behind chocolate, and globally, a large percentage of it comes from West Africa, countries where farming is widespread, but economic conditions can be extremely challenging. And this is where one of the most difficult and widely discussed issues begins. Over the years, reports from journalists, NGOs, and international organizations have raised concerns about labor conditions within parts of the cocoa supply chain, including the use of child labor in some farming communities. Now, it's important to understand the structure. Large corporations do not directly own most of these farms. Instead, they buy cocoa through layers of suppliers, cooperatives, and intermediaries, which makes the system complex and difficult to fully monitor at every level. But that complexity is exactly what has drawn criticism, because even without direct control, major companies are still connected to the supply chain through purchasing power. And critics argue that with that level of influence comes responsibility. Over the years, companies including Nestlé have publicly acknowledged these challenges. They have launched programs aimed at improving transparency, supporting farmers, and reducing the risk of child labor within their supply chains. But despite these efforts, reports suggest that the problem has not been completely eliminated, which is why the issue continues to resurface again and again. And this is where the tension becomes very clear. On one side, global demand for chocolate continues to grow. On the other side, the realities of agricultural production in lower income regions remain difficult to change overnight. And in between those two forces are supply chains that connect millions of consumers to environments they rarely think about. This raises a bigger question. How much responsibility does a global corporation carry for what happens at the very beginning of its supply chain? Especially when that supply chain spans countries with different laws, different economic pressures, and different levels of oversight. There is no simple answer, but the debate itself is what keeps the issue alive, because every time demand increases, the pressure on those systems increases with it. And when you step back and look at everything together, food systems, infant nutrition, water access, global supply chains, you start to see a pattern, not a single controversy, but a series of interconnected systems, each with its own challenges, risks, and consequences. And yet, despite all of this, the company continues to grow. It continues to operate in more countries, sell more products, reach more consumers, which leads to one final question. How does a company remain so dominant even while facing decades of criticism, scrutiny, and global debate?